I'm very pleased to be here this morning. I'd like to thank particularly Anna for inviting me to this event today. Indeed, I hope my idea will be clear because you were just mentioning Vietnam and Cambodia, and I'm just back from Southeast Asia yesterday. I'm still jet-lagged indeed. I like to share with you who are going to start this year my own experience, how what has been done in HIV could be a model for responding to emerging or re-emerging disease. And my first slide is a little bit, let's say, a few words on my background, because when I started myself at the university, I was not really very much interested by infectious disease, indeed. Because at that time, as you could see on this slide, yes, very prominent scientists like Burnett were thinking that in the middle of the 20th century will be the end of the infectious disease, and that will be a significant factor of social life. So myself, I was mostly interested in other human pathology. It turned out that when I got the proposal to work on retroviruses and cancer and leukemia at the Pasteur Institute, I was very much interested by that. So, however, that was somehow a mistake, because we learned that emerging infectious diseases are there since years. Some of them are listed on this slide. And in 1981, finally, the AIDS pandemic reminded us that infectious disease will certainly be there for the rest of the life. So, just to start with few messages, 1981 were the first signals of a new alarming emerging epidemic, AIDS. But what I would like to say on this slide is a few messages for you who are going to start a career. First of all, I did not realize myself how much surveillance of epidemic is important in the world. It's obvious to say that, but this is done generally by epidemiologists, by Center of Infectious Control or UN organization, and it's really how the AIDS epidemic was recognized. Secondly, for us, the virologists, I was a virologist, we were mobilized by the clinician. Before, I was working in my lab on cancer without any contact with clinician. This is something to keep in mind for future epidemic of emerging and re-emerging disease. The role of clinician in observation in the hospital. This is really critical, and this has been critical for the development of research on HIV/AIDS. Third and last message, as a future scientist, be careful about information regarding any emerging and re-emerging disease, like it was the case for HIV/AIDS. You can see on this slide, in the middle of the slide, at the beginning of the identification of this disease, the media were speaking about the gay plague. I can even tell you, when we identified the virus at Pasteur in 1983, the media mentioned the French discovered the virus of the homosexuality. You are laughing, but now, more than 35 years later, we are still suffering of this kind of statement, because this was the start of stigma and discrimination of people concerned by this infection. And you see the people concerned themselves. they were calling for research, no hysteria. So that is my message to start for the future of emerging and emerging disease. Remember this key point. Another message is to keep in mind the importance of translational research. When you are a basic scientist, like I was myself at the beginning, you are interested by the identification of pathogens, the characteristic of the virus, the mechanism by which the virus can induce a disease and so on. But you have to keep in mind that when you are a scientist, you are there to deliver for the benefit of people affected by a disease. And this is a good example. I mean, HIV has been a good example for that. I will not go into detail of this slide. Just look at the color. The blue, the green, and the pink. The blue is more or less basic science. And you see that the green and the pink follow basic science because it's the knowledge and the replication cycle of HIV that have allowed the development of drug for treatment and drug for prevention. So this is, and you can see, last message you can see on this slide, the blue is coming back. The blue is coming back because HIV is not over, and we need some other tool for the future. And the tool will come from basic science again. So this is, I think HIV has been a very good example of the fact that we made basic science, but that was followed soon after by tools for the benefit of patients. The first tool, of course, was the antiretroviral treatment. As I said, the drug has been developed according to our knowledge of the replication cycle, the reverse transcriptase to transcribe RNA into DNA, and the first inhibitors were again the reverse transcriptase, followed by other molecules like a protease inhibitor to block another step of the replication cycle of the virus, and other molecules to block the entry of the virus or to block the integration of the virus into the genome of the cells. And finally, we understood that we need a combination of at least 3 drugs to control the virus, to control the replication of the virus, to partially restore the immune function, to prevent the development of AIDS. And today we can say that we have a combination of treatments that improve the quality of life, to prolong the life expectancy, and also, which is important, the treatment is also prevention. So again, an important message is when you develop treatment, the treatment should be also considered some time for prevention. That might be true also for the future of emerging and re-emerging disease. Prevention, we do not have a vaccine today, but we have developed several scientific evidence that, let's say, the classical tools for prevention are working, like utilization, for example, of condom, intervention to change behavior or harm reduction program in some people. But what I want to focus mostly is on this part of the slide. Today, we know that antiretroviral treatment is prevention because if someone is treated very early on by antiretroviral treatment, we know that he do not transmit to others. That decrease the risk of transmission by 96%, so it's very important. We know that we can use also antiretroviral treatment as pre-exposure prophylaxis, the PrEP. I don't know, by the way, where you are in Italy for the PrEP, but I can tell you that PrEP is used in the United States. PrEP is also used in my country, in France, recognized by the Ministry of Health. to prevent the infection of, in particular, some concerned population like the gay people who are taking a risk, and it's even reimbursed by the Social Security in France. So PrEP is certainly a wonderful tool to try to prevent the infection of the some concerned population. You can see antiretroviral prophylaxis, the efficacy is between 0 to 96%. 0 I can explain immediately. 0 is when there is no adherence. Otherwise is 96-98% efficacy if the people are taking their antiretroviral treatment correctly. The future will be certainly new molecule for PrEP, but also long-lasting ARV. It's starting. There are some data already indicating that we have, using the nano technology, we can have nanoparticles, and using, for example, nanoparticles as implants for long-lasting effect for prevention, but also, by the way, for treatment. Other message which have to be taken in consideration for emerging and re-emerging disease: the need for mobilization at international level against those emerging and re-emerging disease. I was from Pasteur originally, but I did not really understood myself really what was the vision of Louis Pasteur until I started to work on HIV. Because we was in a lab like most scientists, but I was not really concerned about what's going on in a resource-limited setting until HIV appeared. Then I was invited to go in Central African Republic in 1985 for a WHO meeting on AIDS in Africa. And I realized, like many of my colleagues who were there at that time, the situation in Africa, by visiting the hospital, by seeing myself, people dying. I'm not a doctor, but seeing by myself people dying from AIDS, and the doctor has nothing. At that time, we had no antiretroviral treatment. We have no treatment at all, but at least to help the patient to die. It was unbelievable, the situation in those hospitals. So this is how several of us really started to mobilize and started to be implicated in making technology transfer, training, strengthening the capacity on site. I started with Africa, as has been mentioned. Then I also have been involved in Southeast Asia, in particular in Vietnam and Cambodia. So this is true for any emerging or re-emerging infectious disease. Do not think only this is a situation in our countries, in rich countries. Most of the epidemic, you know, I will say a few words at the end on Ebola. But for me, to see people totally afraid about Ebola when Ebola is present since years in Africa, nobody cares about it. We just care when Ebola can reach Spain, France, or United States. This is not acceptable. We should keep in mind other countries as well. So that was the vision, in my opinion, of Louis Pasteur when he was saying that science knows no country because knowledge belongs to humanity and is a torch which eliminates the world. And it's the reason why, after creating the Pasteur Institute in Paris, the second institute he created was in Ho Chi Minh City, together with Calmette. So that he has this vision of translational research for the benefit of population. International mobilization has been also for us as a scientist to provide, to do multidisciplinary research, to provide scientific evidences. And those scientific evidences showing that tools, for example, for diagnosis, prevention, and treatment are validated. We are we should go to the political leaders and health authorities to convince them to implement those evidence-based intervention in their countries and to organize their country for care and access to treatment. This is something also I understood as a scientist. That is my responsibility as well, to try to convince the political leaders and health authorities when we have data to show them that they have a responsibility for their countries. Sometimes alone as a scientist, we are not very successful. So it's very nice, you know, to work together with our colleagues, the activists, the representative of communities affected by the disease. This has been the case for HIV/AIDS. That was, to my knowledge, the first time in the field of disease, human disease, I was going to say infectious disease, but not only, was the first time that the scientists, the health professional, has been working so closely to representative of patients. And this is, again, something to keep in mind for the future of emerging and re-emerging infectious disease. The benefit of working close to community of patients. It's through the activism, certainly, and the participation of communities that we are able to improve countries in terms of training, strengthening capacity and structure and site, and to make also the decision makers to take the decision, as it is shown here. One activist together with Nelson Mandela here trying to convince Nelson Mandela about decision for South Africa, what he did. So this is really for the benefit of the patient. And those activists have been critical in scaling up of the HIV treatment in the world. It's because of them that they made so much pressure on government that it has been major investment since 2003 for the access to care, prevention, and treatment in the world. It's because of this pressure, together with them, the activists, that United States decided, the Bush government decided, for example, to implement what we call the PEPFAR program. It's through this pressure that all the government from rich country in Europe or United States decided to create the global fund for HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And it's also because of them, the activists, and I recommend you to see this movie, 120 beats per minute, which is showing the story of one major organization of activists, ACT UP. That is really the reality of what we went through in the early 90s with them. And it's because of them that it has been a reduction of price of the antiretroviral treatment because of their pressure, sometimes violence, on the pharmaceutical company. And it's also why not only the price has been reduced, but also generic has been developed with price you can see here, $100 per year to treat one patient compared to 25 or 30,000 US dollar in United States. So, and now, I mean, it's never finished because working together with community, we are able to develop novel delivery services for people affected by the disease. The communities today is involved in the in providing the antiretroviral treatment to people concerned in developing countries. They are also involved in the follow-up of the people on treatment in the country. We know that it's not enough health professionals in the countries to cover the problem, and working with the communities is certainly an issue for emerging and re-emerging infectious disease, and to take in consideration mobile health also, which is a wonderful progress today. So as a result, we have seen in the field of HIV a decline of the mortality, with almost 50% reduction of people dying from HIV related disease globally. You can see also on this slide that the percentage of people newly infected with HIV globally has been reduced by almost 40% since 2001. And you can see, of course, on this slide the wonderful benefit of the treatment by seeing that guide before treatment and after treatment in Africa. This is a real pleasure, even for you as a basic scientist, to see the benefit of the treatment for those wonderful people. But this is not finished. This is not finished because globally we have approximately 53% of people on combined antiretroviral treatment in the world. We still have 1 million of HIV-related deaths per year, and each year 1.8 million of people newly infected by HIV. That means that we still have some challenges, and probably it has been also some mistake done in the response to HIV that should be considered for the future of other emerging and re-emerging disease. The key challenges that we have today is certainly biomedical, but not only biomedical, is social, cultural, structural, and also behavior. We have not certainly focused enough in response to HIV on the people, what we call the people left behind. The people highly concerned by HIV infection, of course, MSM, of course, drug user, of course, the sex workers, of course, the transgenders, and the migrants. The migrant is becoming a real problem for us in Europe, by the way. For example, there has been a study done in France and published last year, indicating that the migrants, when they arrive in France, they are not HIV positive. They become HIV positive when they are in France. They got infected in France because of the condition in which they are living, even in our country, in France. More than 50% of them got infected in our countries. This is unbelievable. We cannot leave those people like that. So this, in response to the HIV, has probably been a weakness, and we should take into consideration to have a better leadership, governance in countries, and better national integrated policy. The political willingness is clearly a problem for the response of HIV, but it's a problem generally for emerging and re-emerging disease. We need to have international investment and continue international investment, and we have to fight against repressive legislation, which is a real problem for stigma, discrimination, and of course is an obstacle to reaching the people who are infected by HIV and do not know that they are infected by HIV and continue to infect others. More than 70 countries in the world have repressive measures against people affected by HIV, and this is something that we have to work on it to change the legislation in the world. Otherwise, we will never and an epidemic like HIV. So WHO, UNAIDS, and all the UN organizations are trying, to really push in order to have an end of the HIV epidemic by 2030. For that, they develop what we call the 90-90-90 ambitious target in order to diagnose 90% of people infected by HIV, to treat 90% of them, and on long term to have 90% of them virologically suppressed. The question is it achievable and sustainable in the condition today we have? I will say that we will be, if we use all the tools that science has delivered, in terms of treatment, in terms of preventative tools, including circumcision and other tools for prevention, including the use of antiretroviral treatment as prevention, yes, we will be able to control the HIV epidemic. But we will not be able to eradicate the HIV epidemic. For that, we need a vaccine, we need a cure. It's the reason why science, and that will be always true for any disease, science has to continue in parallel to implementation of tools. For HIV, we need a vaccine, we need a cure, and of course, we will not have a vaccine, we will not have a cure if we are not making basic science in order to understand better latency, immunology, immune response to HIV, pathogenesis of HIV. So this is the main scientific priority if we want to have a world without AIDS. In terms of, and in the middle, by the way, I put the non-AIDS related comorbidity because just to give you the message that there is no barrier between one disease and another disease. Because the people who are on treatment for HIV today, they are doing very well. Their life expectancy is about the same as someone not infected, but a small proportion of them develop what we call the non-AIDS comorbidity. They develop cancer, they develop cardiovascular disease, they develop neurological disorder, a small proportion of them. But this is something to consider, and this is something important to consider also to have novel therapeutic strategy in the future. Regarding vaccine, we have a new perspective since 2009. 2009 was the date of the data of a very large phase 2-3 clinical trials in Thailand, showing for the first time some efficacy of a vaccine, prime boost vaccine candidate with 30%, approximately 30% of protection by this double vaccine candidate. Since then, the new perspective has been the development of very, very efficient, broadly neutralizing antibody originally derived from a small proportion of patients called the elite neutralizers. And the antibodies of those elite neutralizers has been structurally and functionally characterized, and when the structures has been obtained, the scientists have been able to construct new antibodies which are based on this structure. And they have identified new sites of vulnerability which are represented on this slide. And we found out also that non-neutralizing but protective antibodies may be important to consider in vaccine. You can see on this slide that several antibodies that has been constructed are quite advanced already in clinics with interesting data. So we are moving, let's say, to a structure-based immunogen design, and with novel novel delivery system which has developed. In addition, in order to improve the cell immune response, genetic engineering might be interested, and there are some studies already with modified CAR, TCR, and gene transfer in T cell, which are of interest for the future, as well as approaches targeting subpopulation of dendritic cells in order to improve both the production of efficient antibodies and the cell immune response. To give you an example of very, very efficient antibodies, look at this one. This antibodies, which is developed in collaboration with South Africa, CAP256, developed in collaboration between South Africa and United States. You can see here is a study in monkey showing that a single injection of these antibodies totally suppress the infection after challenge of this animal. So this is very impressive. Of course, this antibodies is used like for passive immunization, and we need today to have immunogens that will be able to induce such very efficient antibody. Whether those antibodies are functioning between they are broadly neutralizing or by other mechanisms is under study today. So we are in a new era in the field of HIV vaccine. We have test of concept study of both neutralizing and non-neutralizing antibody, which are ongoing. There is a considerable energy in the field of HIV vaccine since 2010, with a prime boosting in strategy following the data of the TIDE trial, and there are several new efficacy trial ongoing, and we should have the first result by the end of this year. But my message here is really, I think the most important thing is the evolution in the field of vaccine research is that today we have a basic science agenda which is more interactive with clinical trials than in the past. And so I believe that this is good. In addition, we have no dogma. The dogma in the past was we need neutralizing antibody, we need T-cell response. Today we are looking what are the mechanisms we need for protection. We have a strategy integrating both basic and clinical science, as I said, but we have also in hand wonderful novel technology and very high risk concept, which are good, I mean, for the evolution of vaccine research. And finally, vaccine research should not be separate from studies on cure. Which kind of cure are we looking for HIV? It's complicated for HIV because a cure, generally when we speak about cure for any infection, we speak about elimination, total elimination of the pathogen. This will mean for HIV a total elimination of all latently infected cells. We have only one case like that. We call it the Berlin patients, who do not seem to have any cells that carry HIV in his body. But that's all. We do not have been able to repeat a Berlin patient. So I used to say that really to get a cure, it's almost impossible mission. But to get sustainable remission, which means a persistent reduction and control of HIV by a short-term treatment, will be already a big progress, because that means that the people will do well without any treatment and will not transmit with others. And for that, we have proof of concept already. We have proof of concept of remission. I will show on this slide. Is this Visconti, what we call the Visconti patient, which is today an international cohort of patients who have been treated very early on after exposure to the virus. They were treated within 3 weeks after exposure to the virus during acute infection. And their virus was perfectly controlled. And finally, after several years, after 3 years, they asked to their doctor whether they can stop the treatment. They stopped. For some of them, we have 23 patients, they stopped in an average 12 years, and their virus is perfectly controlled. So they are in durable remission. And we are learning a lot from this patient about the immune response. We know that it's not CTL, it's not apparently antibody, but they have a very nice control of the reservoir, which is there, but almost undetectable, and no immune activation, and a specific innate immune response, which seems to be important to control their infection. So we are learning also from this patient. We know that it's going to be difficult because the reservoir cells on treatment are many cells, as you can see on this slide. The major one are resting central and transitional CD4 memory T cells, but other cells, many other cells can serve as a reservoir for HIV. In particular, let's say T follicular helper cells, which are critical for reservoir in the lymph node. We know that the reservoir cells, the cells that contain HIV latently infected by HIV, are present in many tissues: the gut, the genital tract, the lymphoid tissue, etc. And we have learned that the fact that HIV persists on treatment is due to residual viral replication, probably in some compartments, in particular in lymph node or in gut, but also because we have those cells on treatment that carry the genome of the HIV but continue to proliferate, and we learned that they proliferate by clonal expansion, and they have at their surface the expression of immune checkpoint molecules, which are negative regulator of T cell response, which contribute, by the way, to the immune exhaustion. So those characteristics, let's say, of latently infected cells are very similar to the characteristic of tumor cells. The reason why when we work on disease, we should keep an eye on other disease as well, because we can learn from each other. We know that in HIV infection, without any treatment, we have chronic inflammation, which play a major role in the development of AIDS. But on ART, on antiretroviral treatment, we know that there is residual chronic inflammation, and there are data clearly indicating that this chronic inflammation is playing a role in the maintenance of the persistence of HIV on antiretroviral treatment, and indeed the chronic inflammation is also playing a role in many of what I called before the non-AIDS related morbidity, the cardiovascular disease, the cancer, and so on. The reason when we look for new treatment, we look for new treatment for HIV, but also for non-AIDS mortality as well. Where we are today in terms of strategy, we can think about trying, like the Visconti patient, to limit the reservoir by very early treatment, but this is not really feasible at large scale, of course. We can think about it in some cases only to early treatment with antiretroviral treatment, but also maybe with broadly neutralizing antibody. The approaches that has been used and is still used is what we call the shock and kill. Shock to reactivate the latently infected cells by, for example, histone deacetylase inhibitor like Vorinostat, for example, or other molecules which are already on the market. kill, because we know that this strategy alone is not working. That means that we have to associate to other strategy in order, after reactivation of the latently infected virus, to kill immediately the cells which are reactivated by, for example, a vaccine, or in order to stimulate the T-cell response, or the therapy or the treatment which is used in cancer, like anti-PD-1 or PD-1 ligand, for example, immune therapy itself, or by neutralizing antibody, but not by playing the role of neutralizing antibody, through the ADCC mechanism. There are new strategy also which are ongoing. It's less data until now. It's what we call the block and lock strategy, using latency promoting agents. In opposite, we want to definitively block the latent virus in the genome of the cells. Two drugs has been tested up to now, but mostly by in vitro studies, the Curaxin and the DCA TAT inhibitor. Of course, it's too early to say if this approach will work in the future, but it's interesting to continue. Finally, I like to mention gene therapy, because gene therapy is really of interest, at least to help us to understand better which is the best strategy to induce remission if we don't induce a cure. We can make, by gene therapy, cell resistance to HIV, or we can even destroy the HIV genome, which is present in the cells, using the CRISPR-Cas9, for example. This is certainly, there are more and more data coming on this kind of approach. But for the future, certainly we will have a combination again of different therapeutic strategy. However, we need, and there's a reason to keep in mind for any infectious disease, emerging infectious disease or re-emerging infectious disease, to continue to have research on novel biomarkers for which will be predictive for response, predictive of response also to the efficacy of drug. This is the case of HIV. For cure research, we need novel biomarker to predict the efficacy of future treatment, and why not going to personalize cure therapy in the future, keeping in mind that we have affordable and scalable strategy. So I will finish, let's say, for HIV by saying that even for cure today, or for durable remission, we are using a multidisciplinary, integrated and coordinated strategy, integrating all the components of science, basic clinical science, social and economical science, because we need to know whether treatment will be affordable or not for everyone. We need the community engagement. Not easy to engage people living with HIV in novel therapeutic trials today, when you know that they have a treatment with which they are doing very well. So we need to work with them to understand what they are ready to accept, yes or no. For that, we need also social science, by the way. We need to work with others. For example, I mentioned the similarity between HIV persistent and cancer. Link the two scientific community in order to understand and to work better together. We need to work with the private sector, and we need, of course, to have investment. But for that, when you have a scientific agenda well defined at international level, for example, which was the case for HIV Cure, we have been able in only 4 years to multiply by 3 the investment at the international level. So globally, HIV/AIDS has been the first largest epidemic of the 20th century, at the origin of what we call today the global health concept. This epidemic, like probably the future one, is linked to the evolution of the society in the globalization era. HIV has had an impact at all the levels of the society. The society itself, the media, the politicians, the economy of countries, everything was affected by the HIV epidemic. So you have, even when you are a scientist, keeping in mind all these aspects. As a result of this epidemic, it has been an unprecedented international response and profound changes in public health services in the world. But it reminded us that emerging and re-emerging disease will be always there, as Charles Nichols, by the way, was already saying in 1930. So it's not something new. When the Ebola outbreak appeared in 2014 in West Africa, at the very beginning of the identification of the Ebola outbreak, we, the scientific community involved in HIV, were a little bit surprised that we did not keep in mind enough the lesson from the past. Of course, Ebola virus is not HIV. Of course, the Ebola virus do not cause the same disease at all than HIV. But when we started to see the hysteria, it reminds us what happened for HIV. Repressive measure, I mean, in the countries where the population were going, in the forest because they were afraid to be accused to be infected by Ebola, looking very similar to stigma and discrimination that we went through for HIV. They were totally afraid by this epidemic, and it was really no international coordination in response at the beginning of this Ebola epidemic. So we have to keep in mind the lesson from the past, the lesson from the HIV, the lesson now from Ebola. And after a while, really, the government, international organization, NGO, research institutions started to work better together in response to Ebola, more integrative response, as it is necessary for responding to any emerging or re-emerging disease. The interesting point is that when you want to communicate and inform the population locally, it's certainly not through the police, it's certainly not through the international organization. You have to work again with communities, what we have learned from HIV. And interestingly, the community who involved in HIV/AIDS in the country affected by Ebola contacted us and said, can we help? And they did. And it's how really they say, we don't know anything in Ebola, but we can be trained shortly, and we can be involved in trying to be in relationship with the population. They did, and it started to work. So again, keep in mind the need for communities, keep in mind also the need for the development of science in parallel of that. Ebola was followed by other epidemics. Zika is represented here. But today, we have HIV/AIDS, we have many infectious diseases which are still there, and all emerging, re-emerging disease, including also the antimicrobial resistance, which is really something to take into consideration in our world today. But we have in parallel the non-communicable disease that is affecting our countries in Europe, in the United States, our rich country, but also start to affect the developing world. So we have all to work together, both in science, but also with health professionals, in order to invest, but not only for one disease, for global health. And global health is in a new context to take into consideration for the future. A new context of demography, of urbanization and globalization. And with a new pattern of inequities, I was mentioning before the migrants. So we have to keep in mind that if you want to fight against any emerging or re-emerging disease, you must work for social justice. We must work to, on the human rights issues in order to consider this point for any disease. We are in a world of virtual connectedness and individualism, which is good, but can be bad also for the response against such disease. We have to face interdependent crises and challenges, emerging, re-emerging disease, of course, non-communicable disease, but also education, food, climate changes, energy, water. We have to try to work all together on that. Finally, we are in a new economic and security agenda with less political mobilization today around the global health, I must say, and the global solidarity in the world. And this is indicating us how much mutualization is more than ever necessary, as well as solidarity. Finally, my last point is there is not enough progress in terms of a real framework for international property. Finally, keep in mind for any response, and this is my final word somehow, that the response for HIV/AIDS, the message from it is that global, coordinated, and integrative response should be key words for response to any emerging and re-emerging disease. All the components all together, and this is what I learned myself personally by working on HIV. What is the most important for a scientist? Receiving award, it's great, of course. But I remember, you know, at one point I read somewhere that I always wonder, after, you know, all the progress in terms of treatment, in terms of prevention, why somebody did not something about that to make access possible to all. Then I realized myself that I am somebody. So it's how I started to be somehow a scientist activist myself, because we can do something. And as Nelson Mandela was saying, action without vision is only passing time. Vision without action is merely daydreaming, but vision with action can change the world. And for you, keep that in mind for your future career. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think it was really inspiring, especially for us, which are younger stage of our career, because, as you said, being scientists and activists, I think that's really inspiring.
Thank you.
For this especially. Do we have any questions from the audience?
There is one question.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your very exciting presentation. My name is Anna Rizzoli. I'm directing a research center here in the Edmund Bach Foundation. And so we are trying to promote the concept of One Health. So we are trying to bring together scientists working in the field of animal health, because of course we have to keep in mind that most of the infection you mentioned about the emerging threat like Ebola or other or Zika are zoonosis, so they come from animals. But also it's important to keep in mind that our health is depending on what we eat. So we try to promote the concept that this One Health Compass should also include all the food chain, because, for example, in case of HIV, malnutrition, of course, is one of the reasons also why people suffer of several diseases. So I would like just to know what you think about this vision of One Health, and what is for you important when an emerging threat face the humanity, how to work together, because also this interdisciplinarity, to bring together scientists from different fields it is important. So just I was wondering what you think about.
I mean, for me, One Health is part of the concept of global health. We cannot exclude. I mean, all what you said. It's part of improving global health in the world. I mean, that's clearly very important. You were mentioning, of course, animal. By the way, HIV has been originally transmitted by animal as well, by monkey. So, of course, animals are important. You mentioned food. This is clearly important. I'm just coming back from a meeting in Bangkok, the PMAC 2018, where this topic was developed. In particular, I mentioned antimicrobial resistance. Antimicrobial resistance, you have to consider just the food as well. And of course, the animal and the animals that receive sometimes antibiotics, and then the foods contain, of course, resistance to antibiotics. So this is a whole world that should be considered. So it's critically important, of course. The all together is really true more than ever.
So do we have?
So it seems that we are kind of enter a second limbo for HIV, because after benefiting from the great advances, the highly active antiretroviral therapy, we're waiting now for those results that you actually have kind of anticipated, and we hope that they're going to be here fast. However, in this period now, the problem seems to be that the perception is that the general public, at least, kind of got the wrong message. They think, I mean, from my experience to talking to people, that there is already a cure for HIV, and we know that's not the case. And the problem is that, so this causes a lack of awareness, and also the message carried from probably even media and schools, I don't know, is a bit lost. And with 20 or 30% of people that perhaps are not aware of being infected, what do you think, how should we deal with this moment now while more discoveries are coming?
You're right, it's a question of information and education, which is not as important as it was at a certain time. The messages, as you mentioned, are wrong. There are young people that think we have a cure, as you said. I even heard a French deputy saying that we have a vaccine against HIV. So even the politicians have wrong messages as well. So how do we work? I mean, we have to work with the media, of course, for improving the information and the communication. We have to work with school, high school, and because I don't know in Italy, but I know in my country, in France, that they have very limited good information in high school on HIV. Most of the information are old or inaccurate. We have, it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, but we have not enough the implication of the HIV community itself. Because I personally believe, I may be wrong, but if we have more people living with HIV on treatment, going to school, going to high school, making messages on TV or social media about their life with HIV on antiretroviral treatment, maybe the perception will change.
The problem is that this community is hiding because it's afraid of the stigma that you mentioned.
You are right, but not 100% hiding. I know some of them, they are ready to do it. It's not 100%, of course, because some are hiding, as you said. But, you know, it's sufficient to have a small proportion of people that are ready to do that. I met a month ago a young guy, 21 years old. He got infected by HIV 2 years ago. And he said to me, I'm ready. I'm ready to speak with the young people. What I can do. So you have some who have the courage to go. And we should work with them better. Because for us, they don't believe us, the public, by the way, the scientists or the health professional. They say, oh, you want to protect your field. Even the politicians are saying that. So it depends on the politician. You know, some politicians, my previous president, it was easy for me. I was telling him, look, if we have a re-emerging HIV/AIDS epidemic in the world, if we have the emergence of multi-resistance to HIV drug in the world, because you are deciding as one of political leader to decrease the donation of France to the global fund, do it. But I have to inform you before you take the decision of what can be the consequence of your decision. So are you ready now to do it? He said, no, I don't want to take this risk. So it's really depending of your contact in among the politicians. I'm not sure you can do that with Trump, for example, to be clear.
Okay. Any question?
Don't be shy.
I think it's such an honor to have you here that everybody is intimidated to ask you questions. So I would like to ask you a question. You mentioned several times that basic research is very important along with the clinical research. However, it seems that overall in the world the situation is going on reverse, that basic research is now becoming more and more in crisis, that it's more a question demanding to do a translational kind of research. Do you think there is a way to reverse? I know it's a big question and probably difficult to answer, but is there a way to try to reverse and try to send a message that basic research is essential?
I mean, this message, it's obvious for me, because you don't have translational if you don't have basic. It's generally what I say to the decision makers. How you translate without basic science at the origin. You have to tell me, because personally I don't know. So I think I've discussed this with many people. They just answer generally, oh, but we agree. We do not exclude basic research. It's obvious that the first step is basic science, and that everything will come from basic science. But then, you know, the political leaders in most countries in the world today are very much interested in making money. So they are very interested in innovation. By the way, I understood that we don't have the same definition of innovation in the mouth of a politician and in the mouth of a scientist. For me, innovation is trying to have innovative technology or innovative science concept that will make progress in science or provide scientific evidence. But for them, innovation is money. Innovation is to translate research into molecules or into diagnostic tests or preventive tests to make money. It's not for the benefit of people even. It's to make money. So we know that, so we have to try, as us, the scientists, to integrate both, in order to make them to understand that they will reach their goal if they understand that for reaching this goal, they have to consider the very beginning. Otherwise, they will lose. So for that, you have to come to them with arguments and evidences. There is no choice. Yes?
Hi. Almost at the end of your talk, you mentioned the problem of intellectual property and patents. I know little about IDS research, but I think that somehow patent has been a force to drive research, but at a certain point they have been also a force to somehow stop certain kind of research, or also to somehow stop access to medicine. And I think they have a positive role, but also a negative role somehow. And I was wondering whether you can comment on this and whether you have an opinion on how we can improve patenting in the context of course, global health. Thank you very much.
I'm not an expert at all about patent either. My concern, it has been the decision of patent pool, for example, for the company who adhere to this patent pool regulation to make access to treatment for those in need in the developing country, resource limited setting, at lower price compared to rich country. This has limit. Let me give you an example. Hepatitis C treatment, which by the way derives from our knowledge on HIV. Really, it's how the drug has been developed for hepatitis C cure. We are in a situation today that because of the development of generic, because of all the agreement for patent, intellectual property, we have the development of generic, we have the possibility for company to give good price in low resource country. For example, I'm just back from Vietnam. I heard that Vietnam could have the treatment, whole treatment for curing HCV of $100 US. This is nothing really. But if you look the price now in our countries for curing HCV is not acceptable. It's thousands of euro for curing HCV in our country. So something is wrong. I can understand that the rich countries should do an effort for developing countries, but there is some limitation concerning the benefit that the company can have on some treatment like HCV, but this is true for many other things. So it seems to me that, and I'm not a specialist again, but regulation should be made on intellectual properties in order to improve through a framework what could be the future of the intellectual properties and how we can overcome this excess, let's say, of some pharmaceutical company. I have in mind, for example, Gilead. Gilead, it's a real problem. And other company, we can work with them. So something is wrong and needs some regulation. Why it's easier to work with some pharmaceutical company more than others, with others. This is something that I don't understand. I even sometimes do not understand why, because of the intellectual property, because of the patent, why we cannot think about a tax of the money that the company are making going back to the people in need for access to treatment in general, not only for HIV. So, I mean, all this thinking, it seems to me that it has been the Doha agreement in the past, but since the Doha agreement, to my knowledge, nothing is moving. So we need to have something done by people who are experts, which I am not, by the way.
So we have one here.
Good morning. I am a journalist, so I'm not an expert at all. So I beg your pardon for my naivety in the question that I'm about to do. I've read some piece of news. There seems to be a kind of trend among people with infection, HIV infection. I've read, maybe it's not correct. The quality of life of people with infection has become so better, so good with the treatments that we have mentioned, that there seems to be a lower standard of protection, maybe in basic activities such as sexual encounters. So people with infection risk so much more because the quality of life has become so much better, underestimating maybe the damage of the disease and the potential of infection. This is a fact. Can you confirm this trend, or it is false? Thank you.
I'm not sure I fully understand your point, but I think your point is very close to the point that we mentioned before. We are in a situation today where we have a combination of treatment which is working really very well, and it's only one pill per day. I mean, who is not taking one pill per day, and but it's a pill for life, and the quality of life is very similar to the quality of life of someone who is not infected. For sure, that is the reality. As a consequence of this and the virus is perfectly controlled, and if the people are adherent to the treatment, they do not transmit the virus to others if they are on treatment. So this is great. However, this message, let's say, is taken by some people, in particular the young population, but also for a proportion of the gay population, like, oh, we can take risk. We can take risk because if we got infected, we will be treated, and we will doing very well. So it's what we were mentioning before, what we can do about that, because the messages are partially true, but the messages and the information should be accurate also concerning how do you live with HIV on treatment for life. It's why I was saying it would be good if people infected by HIV, treated, doing very well, could testify by themselves what is their life with HIV on treatment. Because when you talk to some of them, it's not so easy. It's not so easy, and I think coming here, we are talking that, for example, it has been several studies of social science to ask people living with HIV in United States, in France, in Netherlands. They ask the social scientists the question, what are you expecting, what do you like for the rest of your life? You are doing well with treatment. What do you like the scientists to develop for you today? And around 80% of them answer a treatment that we can stop. So that means that's not so perfect because they want something else. And then they ask, but why, since you are doing well? And the vast majority of them say, because on treatment, I still have fear to transmit the virus to others. Because on treatment, I still have stigma and discrimination. So it's not so easy to be on treatment for the rest of your life when you are an HIV-infected person. And the reason why, because they are the best to speak about that. Those people that are really themselves infected by HIV on treatment, I think they are the best to explain to the young generation, to explain to the young people why they should be careful and not get infected.
Other questions?
And by the way, also we have to take into consideration sexually transmitted disease globally, not only HIV. Because of PrEP, for example, there are several studies that show that PrEP is wonderful to avoid infection by HIV, but we see an increase of other sexually transmitted disease. So this is a bad consequence of the usage of PrEP.
So do we have other questions, or? So, thank you.
Thank you.
So I wish to thank again Professor Barré-Sinoussi for coming here. She had a long travel from France, so we are really grateful for you for being here. We have a small memory from Trento. I'm sure that you will leave us a big memory for being so inspiring to PhD students, to mentor, and to all of us. So thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.